So it started, great. So first, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, their rich culture and connection to country. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge elders from other communities who may be with us today. I'm actually on the land of the Eastern Maar, but my shire also covers the traditional owners of the Gujranamara, Japwaring and Gujini people. So we're at the sort of intersection of a number of traditional owners. Today's webinar is the second one we planned in a series of webinars provided by Rural Councils Victoria to our members. And this is a new initiative we've undertaken to complement the RCV forum that occurs every year as an in-person event. So today I'd like to welcome the staff from Ironbark Sustainability, who won the contract to produce the Climate Change Toolkit for Rural Councils Victoria, and it was funded by a grant from Regional Development Victoria. So I'm going to welcome the staff from Ironbark. Just before I do that, this type of project is one we will be looking at in future. We did an earlier one in terms of developing a template for the long-term financial plan. And our idea is to try and develop toolkits that are going to be useful to our members, many of whom don't necessarily have the resources to do these pieces of work themselves. And it's silly for us all to be going off trying to reinvent the wheel. So we will be looking at more of these projects. So I'd like to welcome Evan Davies from Ironbark. He is the consulting unit leader of the climate program who managed the project. And he's also joined by other staff who've helped produce the toolkit, Jenny Frieden, who's on the screen separately, Sophie Beard, who's sitting with Evan, and Cece Hislop, who's also joined us online. So welcome to you. We're looking forward to this overview of the toolkit, and there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. And I'm now going to hand over to Evan. Thanks very much, Evan.
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. And hi, everyone. It's really great to be here with you today. And we're really excited to share the toolkit and, the process that we went through to develop it, and then answer any questions that anyone might have on it. So I'm just going to share my screen now. And hopefully everyone can see that. And I'd also just like to quickly acknowledge traditional owners on the land that we're meeting. So Sophie and I are here on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and also acknowledge all of the traditional owners on the various lands that people are meeting on here today. So a quick overview of what we're of the agenda for today's session. So the welcome, which we've just covered. So we're just going to quickly, and we don't want to delve too much into this. We kind of want to get into the outcome and really discuss that in more detail. But I think in workshops like this, it's always good to kind of start with a little bit of project context, just to get everyone on the same page. And then we just want to really outline quickly the development process. And one of the key things that we want to kind of highlight here is just the really good consultation that we got with RCV members throughout the development, and that's really informed how it's ended up. Then we'll do a quick overview of the toolkit. Hopefully people have had a chance to look at it for themselves though. And then we'll move on to the Q&A session. And really we're trying to devote as much time as possible to answering your questions. But if you do have any questions as we go through, please feel free to put your hand up or speak out, and we can just answer them there. So in terms of the project context, so the brief that we were given for this project was to develop a climate change toolkit which supported rural Victorian councils to deliver on their climate change responsibilities. So responsibilities has been a big focus of this, which I'll discuss in a moment. and then also to capitalise on the benefits and the opportunities of the low carbon transition. And we recognise that, you know, the transition to a clean, low carbon economy is occurring. And so, you know, making sure that councils can position themselves well to maximise the benefits and ensure that they're not left behind as part of that transition. And as was mentioned by Marianne, this obviously RCV are the commissioning agents for us to do this work. That was funded through Regional Development Victoria. So this is just the project team. There were more people involved in this, but these were the main team, and it's just nice to acknowledge it. So starting with myself, who I did lead this project, but was given a lot of support from Jenny and Sophie, both who are here on the call today and can answer your questions. But also I'd like to acknowledge our other colleagues, Roman and Paul Brown, who many of you may know as the Managing Director of Ironbark, who are both closely involved in this project as well. So onto the process that we undertook to develop the toolkit. So it really started out with a review of local government climate change roles and responsibilities and legislative requirements in Victoria. As I said, one of the key things that underpinned the purpose of developing this toolkit was looking at what are the responsibilities of local government. So starting with a legislative review was a really important thing, but also looking at what other agreements were in place between different levels of government. So there was a COAG meeting that we referenced in 2015, which looked at what are the different roles that state, local and federal government have. So looking at things like that to underpin some of this work. Then we did a survey of RCV members, really to find out what work was already going on, you know, how many councils had climate change policies, how many had developed an emissions inventory or developed an emissions action plan or an adaptation plan. And yeah, so this is a really good for us to gauge, you know, the level of existing knowledge out there. And then actually this survey was quite useful in us identifying case studies and examples that we could use throughout the toolkit as well. We also then did some key stakeholder interviews. So in particular with the Greenhouse Alliances and CASB. We also did have some individual interviews with some councils themselves, which were a really valuable source of information. We held 2 member workshops, which are quite well attended. I don't have the numbers in front of me exactly, but I think we had 19 different councils participate in those workshops. So yeah, really good response. So that was great, and that really helped to inform some of the outcomes. I then presented at the RCV conference on the 2nd of September that I'm sure a lot of people on this call were a part of. And then after we developed the draft toolkit, we actually had it reviewed by a council representative. So Dave Collins from Wellington Shire was kind enough to put up his hand to review and provide some really good feedback, as did the RCV committee as well. And, you know, both of those review processes did result in changes and modifications to the toolkit, and I believe helped us produce a better toolkit in the end. And then obviously we did the final graphic design of the toolkit. Now, moving on to, I guess, you know, what we heard in the consultation. I think it's important to reflect on this because, again, this did really kind of, you know, steer us in the direction of, you know, how we were going to develop it. So probably the first 2 things that we heard, one was obviously that low internal resourcing is an issue for many rural councils, and that the guidance needed to be tailored to that. Now, I won't speak any more about this yet because I'll come back to this point, and this was a really important consideration that we did. Another really important consideration was that as I guess a baseline across many councils, not all councils of course, it was seen to be a low internal prioritisation of climate action with many councils. So there was really, from people we spoke to, there was a really strong need to demonstrate the benefits, including some of the financial benefits of action. And so this is something that we've really tried to include in the really in the first document, the overarching guidance note, make it clear what some of the benefits for climate action, and why, even from an operational, maintenance or financial perspective, it still makes good business sense and operational sense to start looking at particularly some of the energy efficiency and renewable energy actions right now. Other bits of feedback that we received, and this came through the survey and through the workshops, but some specific requests that we got was members were really keen to have a summary of all legislative requirements as well as risks, so they could use that to include in presentations and briefing notes, and really be able to effectively make the case of why councils need to start considering some of these things. There was also a request for example policies and plans to be included, including from other councils. And one of the things we tried to do when developing the toolkit is really look for examples from the RCV membership. So what we didn't want to do is put examples from, inner city Melbourne councils or, New South Wales or Queensland councils. So in almost all cases, I think there's potentially one exception. All of the case studies and the example policies that we have used have been from RCV members themselves. That one exception is, I think we used an example from the Greater Shepparton City Council, which is not a RCV member, but obviously, does share some of the same characteristics and considerations as a lot of members. We also got a request for an org chart outlining roles across council. This was an interesting request and something we really thought about, and we actually made it the focus of our second workshop to work with members as well to map out what the different roles were, and so we've included that in the first guidance, first module, and so I think, hopefully that will be really valuable to staff trying to do this for the first time. And then there was also lots of requests for case studies and good examples, which we've tried to pepper as much as we can through the documents. One other request that we did get was for templates. There was a lot of requests for people that kind of have ready to go pre-populated templates that we could use. We didn't provide these in the end. Basically, based on our experience, we find that providing templates that are, universally or applicable to a large number of councils is quite different, and that, councils, while you might be facing some of the same policy contexts or the same climate challenges, the social, environmental, demographic, all of those, factors really do vary even from council to council, and that, templates, while they seem like a great idea, are not always as easy to use as they think, because what might be perfectly suited for one council, small differences in the neighbouring council means it's a bit of a square peg in a round hole. So the approach we've tried to take to do that is to provide example policies and outline the steps that people would need to take to develop their own plan or own policy or something like that. And trying to do this in a way that means that it can be easily adapted and tailored to local circumstances. And moving on to the toolkit itself. So as I mentioned at the start of the last slide, one of the main messages that we heard early on in the consultation is around, the low resourcing. And, one of the things that, we really heard and do really understand with rural councils is that a rural council may only have 0.6 of a position that is working on climate change or, even in, environmental sustainability issues. And often it's 0.6 shared with two other areas. So, they may have responsibility for waste or other areas as well. And so as a result, long and dense guidelines don't work, and, people can see them as quite inaccessible. So the issue for us, however, and this is something that we thought a lot about, is that with a topic like climate action, there is a lot of contextual information we have to cover, and there's a lot of guidance that needs to be provided. And given that, it ranges from mitigation to adaptation, looking at, your own operations and services, but then also looking at council's role in the community, there is a lot of breadth to cover. So this was something that we were constantly considering as we were developing the toolkit. And so the approach that we decided to develop for this was to develop a toolkit that had a series of modules. And so first of all, we developed an overarching guidance note. And so this is trying to summarize, the broader context, so environmental, policy context, etc. And then a series of modules. One on integrating climate change into decision making, another on adaptation planning, one on corporate emissions reduction, one on community emissions reduction, and then finally a checklist. And so together, I think that all of the toolkits amount to about 127 pages, but we do not recommend that anyone sits down and reads these all together. And that's not the way that they're being written or designed. Our recommendation is that you read the sections that you need at the time, and you use the toolkit more as a reference document that you can keep returning to. And the checklist as well has been done in a way that can help you guide staff look at, well, what do I need to know when? I definitely encourage people to, skim through all of them and look at what's coming up. But certainly, the way we do this is that you don't need to read all 5 documents and the checklist before you can start doing any work. You could, just read the first one and then maybe a couple of sections of the second one, and then you could start doing some action from that point. And lastly, what I was just going to do is just highlight each of the 5, just how we have kind of designed them and intended them to be used, and then we'll pause and ask if anyone has any questions. So the first document, and this is the one document that I do recommend everyone reads first, is the overall guidance note. And so what we've tried to do is really provide all of the context that is really critical to know when you are kind of, first setting out trying to do work in this space. So, it starts by covering, what I would call basics. So looking at, climate change in Victoria, trying again not to go into very dense information, but providing, some really key snapshot information, but then giving links and references for where people can do a deep dive if they want to, looking at the difference between adaptation and mitigation, and also, trying to encourage people to start thinking about making sure that the solution that people are looking at is commensurate to the problem. And, when we're dealing with something big like climate change, obviously no council is going to solve climate change on their own, but everyone has an opportunity to make really strong and tangible action. And so making sure you're thinking about the scale of your response compared to the challenges that we're collectively facing. Then looking at roles and responsibilities. And so, again, trying to kind of build awareness of that different actors have different responsibilities. So, a local government responsibility is different from a state government and different from federal government. So we've outlined some of the different roles, but also then community and individuals have different roles as well. Looking at what Victorian legislation says is really important, obviously, because that underpins a lot of what we need to do. Victorian legislation itself is quite world leading, but still, if you only followed what the legislation said we had to do, the response wouldn't really be enough at this stage to really kind of, ensure that, regional communities can be, resilient and thriving into the future. Also outlined what some of the liability risks are and provided some references to other documents. And then again, based on some of the feedback, really tried to outline what some of the benefits and opportunities for rural councils are, and then, what some of the specific barriers that rural councils are facing and how they can address them. And again, this barriers bit, we actually used one of the workshops to, in the first workshops, we identified what some of those barriers were. And then I think in the second workshop, we actually worked with the people in there to say, all right, so what are your recommendations for how to address the barriers? So, while some of the recommendations to address barriers came from us, a lot of them actually have come from RCV member staff as well. And there's lots of links to things like Basecamp platforms and, other resources there. So I think that's really valuable. But if I was to kind of summarize, what this first document does, it's really about giving your staff the background info they need to, start, preparing the briefing notes, building the case, justifying, why climate action needs to be taken. So, so it's one that I definitely recommend everyone reads first. The second one, probably at least half of this one, I'd recommend that people read straight away. And what this one is really about is it helping staff and councils establish the internal infrastructure that they need, which will enable and support climate action. And so climate change, as I'm sure most people are aware, for a long time it was probably siloed in, the environmental and sustainability team, but it really does cut across council operations, both in the potential impacts that it will have, whether that's to, health and community care, whether it's to, looking at the impact of fleet or buildings or properties, the risk to buildings or properties, or how, ESD or renewable energy can help reduce emissions. So it really cuts across all areas. And so, a really good starting point is to start, is to establish a working group across council and then build that awareness of what the different responsibilities are. And so that's that table that we put in this first module, is an attempt to do that. Obviously, it doesn't cover everything, but it covers, I think, quite a lot of what different areas of responsibilities are, and certainly is a really good starting point for your staff to start building that awareness and then developing that over time. The other kind of key action that can be really helpful to do at the start of a council's journey on climate action is to develop a climate change policy, because this really does help your staff have a clear direction on what council wants. Obviously, a policy has to be approved by councillors, and can be a short document which really outlines what council's key targets are, what their priorities are, and also what some of the other things that they want to be considered, and whether that's ensuring that that council is able to capitalise on some of the economic development opportunities. So kind of integrating those priorities in, so it kind of provides that framework, and then council staff can go ahead with the confidence that what they are developing will be supported by council, and can give a really clear strategic direction. So there's some really foundational pieces that I think we would recommend. And then other information in this module is examples of what some of the requirements, and some of these are legislative requirements of integrating climate change into strategies and plans. So it's a legislative requirement now that municipal health and wellbeing plans include climate change consideration. And then also some information on using scenarios to inform decision making. But as I've noted there, that's something that we don't recommend people start out doing. It's, once we've got some of the, competencies built within council, that's, I guess, a bit of a more advanced way to, make sure that climate change is really integrated throughout council decision making. The rest of the modules really are more designed as step-through guides, and this is where we kind of see them as reference. So, for example, Module 2 is a step-through guide for adaptation planning, and we would expect that, say, if a council officer is using this to start developing an adaptation plan, that maybe you skim through it at the start to get a sense of all of the different steps that are required, but then kind of use this really as a reference document that the staff can go back to a number of times as they're developing their plan. So this one outlines some key adaptation concepts that are really important to know, outlines 9 steps to develop an adaptation plan, includes some case studies, and also provides links to other tools and guidance documents when people do want to delve that a little bit deeper. Then modules 3 is focused, again, it's a step-through guide, but focused on developing a corporate emissions reduction plan. So looking at developing an inventory, setting targets, developing an emissions reduction plan. One of the things we've done here is provide a list of common opportunities for rural councils based on a rural council's typical emissions profile, and also introduced concepts like the emissions reduction hierarchy, which looks at, really recommended approach to reducing emissions, which is, starting with things like energy efficiency and renewable energy before moving on to things like fleet and electrification of fleet and gas systems, and then moving down to purchase of offsets really is a last step in the emissions reduction hierarchy. And we've also made some notes in this document about when additional external support may be required. So one of the things that we often recommend is that councils look at developing a science-derived target, so a target that is looking at what emissions reduction is required to keep average global temperature rise to in line with either 1.5 or 2 degrees, which are the Paris Agreement targets. Now, that's something that is probably too complicated for any one council to develop themselves, but there are lots of consultants and other experts out there that can support council to do that. So where we think that it's probably unrealistic that a council will do that themselves, we've made reference to that. And then finally, going on to the last module, which is quite similar to module 3, but this one's obviously focused on community emissions reduction, and so therefore has a bigger focus on how councils can influence emissions reduction within their community, as opposed to looking at just direct action councils can take to reduce their own operational emissions. But the steps it goes through are quite similar. Developing an inventory, which is available online, though, through the snapshot or the climate snapshot website, which we've made reference to. Setting a target, developing a plan, and again, we've provided a list of common mitigation opportunities, interventions for rural communities and councils, and then looking at how councils are going to monitor and evaluate the plan. And then the final piece, and I'll open it up to questions, is the checklist. And again, the checklist is more detailed than this, but I just put a screenshot of the getting started bit. And so again, before people do anything, our recommendation is to, to take these actions to help establish climate change as a key consideration. And so this is some of those things that we recommend staff to do. So develop an understanding of local government, climate change roles and legal responsibilities. And you can find that in the guidance note. And again, as you kind of work through, you might look to establish a cross-organisational climate change working group, and you can find that in the module. But then whether councils want to do everything together, or whether they might want to, say, start with developing a corporate emissions reduction plan, or start by developing a corporate adaptation plan, then there is similar guidance in the checklist for those. So that's just our quick snapshot of the tool, and now we're really, I'll actually throw back to Marianne now and open up for any questions.
Great. Thanks, Evan. That was gives a really good overview. If people could either, if you've got your camera on, put your hand up, or use the little hand that's available through Zoom if you've got questions. So happy to open it up to questions. All happy. Perhaps I can pose a question to some of the attendees. Who would consider that they're well advanced on the path of dealing with climate change issues in their shire? Is anybody filling in that position? No. Tom, you're saying yes? Tom Crook from East Gippsland?
I think our shire is starting to engage in the space and has made some really positive moves. For example, the power purchase agreement was a great step forward that sort of insulated us against the fluctuations in the electricity market. So that's been a great sort of working example for some of our councillors who are, let's say, less convinced of the challenges that we faced. that there are some real opportunities in this as well. So that's been a real positive for us, I think. I think there's still some real challenges ahead in terms of understanding the breadth of the implications and the real, cross-organised. This is something that affects every facet of what council does in one way or another. So I think our council's sort of engaging with that space in a good way. There's obviously more that we can do, and part of that is around education of the councillor group itself. But yeah, I think we're moving in the right space, that's for sure.
Okay. I see in the chat, Gail Ma, you indicated that your council, I can't see which council you're from.
Yes, I'm Wellington Shire, and in our council plan, we've actually made climate change the #1 priority. So as a result of that, the power purchase agreement, but it goes even more to that too, basic ensuring that, we've switched over our lighting to LED. We're looking at rolling out the car charging for electric vehicles. We've already got 2 or 3 that we've rolled out, with more to come. So there's it's all small steps, but I guess we've certainly been forced to consider climate change with the changing regulations with regard to timber industry, renewables, that is approaching very fast. And it's, I guess the question has always been whether we're left behind or do we want to try to be ahead. And we're certainly trying to be ahead. And I guess the next step is really the educational side with the community and the impacts of climate change, and what does that mean for our coastal communities and those in the Highlands.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just add there as well that we use the Greening Wellington plan as one of our case studies in the toolkit. So yeah, that was a really great example, I think.
Yeah, I just see Sanders Macaulay Councillor Sanders Macaulay from Murrindindi. Sanders, do you want to just give us a bit of an overview of what Murrindindi is doing as well? You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I've got poor network here today. Yes, certainly. Corinne Haslam, you're on board here, is our resident champion councillor, and she's basically dragging us along, kicking and screaming, if you like, and she's in the most beautiful manner. We have done most of what has been said before. We're trying to get the community involved. We've had a community consultation already. We've got our action plan, and we're well on the track there. So are you there, Corinne? Do you want to add to that?
Yep, there she is.
Yes, there she is.
Corinne, did you want to add anything further to? Yeah.
Sorry, I agree, Sanders, and I've got problems with internet as well, so that's why I was on no video. We are well underway with our climate action plan, which is obviously important. It's great to have community on board. It's just putting the things in place and finding the right method as to doing it. And I noticed even what was said before, get your energy efficiency sorted before you worry about the EVs. So it's just working out those finer details and not trying to take big steps. You've got to take the baby steps and get people on board. So I think we're well on the way.
Okay. I see in the chat Golden Plains have just adopted a climate emergency plan. Jen, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So actually, I'm very proud to say that David Collins, the one who helped review the document was he's my former boss. He's just moved to Brimbank, but he was really instrumental in getting council to both declare a climate emergency as well as getting me on board. And I, now we've brought on somebody else who can do sustainability work. And then so part of my, half my role is now dedicated, I developed the climate emergency plan, which got adopted, and now we're starting to deliver it. But yeah, it's been a really good process because it's involved, there's a lot of actions that involve staff from all over council. So getting them to understand how their roles are impacted, and we're going to have a launch event next year to try and kind of socialize it a bit more and get people excited.
Okay. Tom, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I guess just a reflection on my own experience with the climate emergency declarations. I have no hesitation in believing that we are in a climate emergency, whether we choose to declare one or not. I don't think for our council that it's particularly politically palatable to declare a climate emergency, but I'd certainly be really interested in the Golden Plains Shire experience and their emergency toolkit, because I think while our council may be reluctant or there is not an appetite to declare a climate emergency, lots of the actions that are being taken under that declaration are things that we still need to do. And the other observation is that I'll make is there's a lot of things, obviously, as organisations, council can do to lead communities in this space. But we're also increasingly confronting it in the planning space. We've got a planning application before us at the moment for Lakes Entrance for a subdivision that is likely to meet refusal on planning grounds because of coastal inundation under sea level rise. And while people may choose to not accept the science, those things are starting to be almost, we can't ignore those things anymore. So there's a real role in community education and people starting to understand that, well, you might not believe it's human caused, or the causes are almost irrelevant. This is happening, and it's something that we need to engage with right across both the organisation and with the community.
Jen, can I just ask you a question? Did your council declare a climate emergency, or have they gone down the path of just developing the emergency plan without a declaration?
They did declare, yeah. But it was before I was hired, and I'd be happy. So Dave Collins, actually, he developed a really comprehensive briefing note detailing why he thought council should declare. So I'd be happy to send that through if that's useful, Tom. But yeah, we did declare. And then as part of that declaration was the commitment to develop the climate emergency plan.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Now, I see, Mindy, you've got your hand up and you posted in the chat as well. So
yeah,
over to you.
Thanks, Marianne. I didn't quite finish my comment before I pushed the wrong button. It was just really to appreciate the fact that the council's legal responsibilities have been addressed in this toolkit. Although I haven't seen the toolkit, I'm looking forward to reading that and understanding better what our legal responsibilities are, because obviously it's been in the Local Government Act that we need to pay attention to climate change. It needs to be considered. And as far as I know, well, we in East Gippsland are, coming across these planning applications now, which really test us with regards our understanding of what the implications of climate change, I think. But as far as I know, it hasn't really been tested legally, but I think that must be ahead of us somewhere.
Yeah, I can just make a couple of comments on that. So definitely have a look through what we put in the guidance note. Where we basically came to with this is there were 3 key acts that really kind of inform council's legal responsibility. So the Local Government Act, as mentioned, is really paramount, and the fact that it has been included now as an overarching governance principle, the need to consider climate change, adaptation planning and mitigation, I think is really important. And we also outlined that There's the establishment of the Audit and Risk committees as well. They're responsible for kind of assessing, councils, the implementation of the governance principles. So I think that there's quite a clear role that Audit and Risk committees have on now kind of considering climate change risk. And I think that can be quite foundational. In the other responsibilities in the in the Climate Change Act, there is some very direct and clear-cut responsibilities. So the Climate Change Act references 6 other what are called scheduled pieces of legislation. So these are things like the Health and Wellbeing Act, the Environmental Protection Act, the Water Act, etc. And so any decision that is made under any of those acts must consider climate change, both in adapting or reducing risks of climate change and reducing impact on climate change. And so that's where you get something like, the requirement that a public health and wellbeing plan must consider climate change. And so that is a very specific and very clear-cut legislative responsibility. The next one is, and then also in that one, you have the legislated net zero emissions target by 2025. Now, at this stage, councils have the right to make a voluntary pledge as part of that. There isn't a flow-on legislative requirement, but as government, as we start getting closer to that 2050 day, and also the government's now set legislated interim targets, as we get close to those interim targets, if it looks like the state is not going to meet their commitments, I think it is likely that we may start seeing some more strict enforcement, some more strict requirements. Whether they become legislative requirements or otherwise is to be determined. And then, of course, the other one is the Planning and Environment Act. Now, that itself doesn't reference climate change. It references the Victorian planning provisions, but they were updated in June this year and now include specific reference to reducing climate risk and net zero, achieving net zero, renewable energy, things like that. So there's potentially quite a big flow-on implication from that very recent Victorian planning provision change. And then the last thing I'll just quickly say is, with the things around, planning applications and, whether to, about council approving them due to potential climate risks, this is where it's not so much about what legislation says, but it's about the risk of being found liable for a decision that didn't account for climate change. And that gets very complicated. So what we've done is provide a very quick overview of what the current, and that's all based on common law as well. So it is about precedents, but there are some examples of when, it's becoming a bigger consideration. And that one, we've provided some links to some other work that was done by DELP to look at what local government's responsibilities were in that. So there's definitely stuff there, and that risk of liability could become actually one of the bigger driving factors in the future.
Mm. Marianne, I'm wondering if it's Mendy again. Yes. I wondered if I could just ask a follow-up question.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, we've got time. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Evan. It was about your comments about Audit and Risk's role in monitoring council's consideration of climate change. What's the mechanism? Would that be an internal audit process or something like that?
So what we've, I think this is the Greater Shepparton example that we put up. So I think we've provided in the toolkit an example of Greater Shepparton where they've developed the Audit and Risk Committee terms of reference, and they've included how they're going to consider climate change as part of that. But one of the things that we often recommend when we do work for local governments is that climate change is included in the strategic risk register of councils, and there could be a number of strategic risks that falls into, whether that's financial, whether it's risk of liability, other things like that. But by having it in council's strategic risk register, it actually, what it really does is it just puts it on the agenda, you know, once a quarter or, you know, and requires that they start being reported on, you know, internally and stuff like that. So that's probably one of the best ways of actually integrating it, really getting it quite prominent in council's decision making. And yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Are there any further questions? There's been a couple of things posted in the chat. Kate is going to circulate Golden Plains emergency action plan, which Jen has kindly said she will provide to the participants. One of the other things that was flagged before today was should we do slightly different session on climate change targeted at councillors and senior staff. So if anyone's got any views on that, if they think that would be beneficial, or I'd be interested to hear from you today, because we can certainly look at that as, which might look slightly different. I think this session today has given a really good overview. So if you haven't had a look at the toolkit, it probably would be really good to look at that. I'm assuming it's available on the website, Kate, at this point in time. So whether it's something that if there was sufficient interest, we'd look at running something in the new year as sort of as a follow-up, but also perhaps specifically targeting councillors and senior staff. So I'd be interested in any comments or feedback in regard to that, if you think that would be beneficial, or should we be looking at some particular aspects that people perhaps find they need either advice or support. Tom, you've got your hand up.
Just speaking for my own council, I think an opportunity for councillors to engage in this space a bit more wholeheartedly would be really welcomed from myself. And I think the best way to do that is to find ways that make the issue relevant to particular councillors. And I think for our council, maybe that would be around things like climate's impact on infrastructure. You know, there was a brief pre-meeting discussion about the road network today, and obviously our road network is just taking a battering from extreme events. I think the other interesting mechanism to talk about it would be in the planning space.
Yep. Okay, that's really good feedback, Tom. So we could look at doing something that is focused on that, because I think the decision that your council's looking at with regard to that Lakes Entrance proposal is probably one that a number of us will be experiencing, particularly whether it's coastal developments or river developments, those sorts of things. And obviously that has been an issue not only in Victoria but in other parts of the country this year with the weather that we've had. So I think that's that's good feedback. Thank you for that. Does anybody else have any other comments or questions that they'd like to make? Yeah. I think if there's no further questions or comments, I'll wrap it up. I'd like to thank the Ironbark team, because I think it's given us all a really good overview of the kit, which I would highly recommend. There's a bit of holiday reading there for you. But I think, you know, this is really, for some of us, it's the start or the very early part of the discussions about how we deal with this particular issue, which is obviously having a significant impact on our communities this year, but with floods. But as we know from past experience, many of our communities experience bushfires. We could still have a very bad bushfire season, albeit it might be later than usual. And then there's severe storms. So I think it's something that we need to be looking at. And there are positive opportunities here in terms of, you know, the financial implications amongst others. So again, thanks to the Ironbark team, and thank you to all who have participated today. We will keep you posted about any follow-up sessions, and thank you for the feedback in the chat as well. So thanks very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Evan. Thanks, Marianne.
Yep.
See you Sunday, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you just want to stay online for a minute? Yep. Yeah. Oh, and I was going to say if Andrew wanted to